Welcome to Sunny's Mindset Lab podcast. Today, we're exploring Behave with its author, Robert Sapolsky. This conversation is about understanding why humans behave the way they do, from biology and brain chemistry to culture and morality.
Thank you, Sunny. Behave was my attempt to show that human behavior only makes sense when you look at all the layers that lead up to an action.
It's the ultimate question, isn't it? Why do we do the things we do? You see these incredible acts of altruism on one hand, and then these horrific acts of violence on the other. How can we even begin to understand the biology behind such opposites?
That's the central puzzle, because biologically, the action can be identical. The same muscles contract to pull a trigger as to pull someone to safety, the exact same motor output. So the interesting part isn't the mechanics of the behavior, but the meaning of it. And to get to the meaning, you have to understand the context.
In the book, you introduce this incredible framework for understanding that context. You say to understand a behavior, you have to look at what happened a second before, a minute before, and all the way back to 1,000,000 years before. Can you walk us through that structure?
Absolutely. It's the organizing principle of the whole book. Instead of starting with evolution and working forward, which can feel deterministic, I wanted to work backward. We start with the behavior itself and ask what happened in the brain 1 second before. Then we peel back the layer. What happened in the environment minutes before that prompted that brain activity? Then hours to days before, what did hormones do to change that person's sensitivity to those environmental triggers? And we keep going back to adolescence, childhood, fetal life, and then to culture, and finally to evolution. It's about seeing how all these layers interact to produce that one single moment of behavior.
Okay, so let's start there. 1 second before a behavior. We're in the realm of pure neurobiology. What's happening in the brain in that final instant?
Right. In that last second, your motor cortex is sending signals down your spinal cord to your muscles. But that's the end of the story, really. The question is, who told the motor cortex to do that? What part of the brain made the decision? That's where it gets complicated.
I think for a lot of people, the immediate suspect would be the amygdala. It gets called the fear center or the aggression center. Is it really that simple? The amygdala fires and we lash out?
That's the common view, but it's far too simplistic. And frankly, it's wrong. Yes, the amygdala is fundamentally involved in fear and aggression, but it's not a button for rage. It's more about processing ambiguity and social information. It activates when you see a stranger's face that you can't quite read. It activates when you see a loved one in pain. It's learning. So if you see the amygdala light up in a brain scanner, it doesn't tell you what the person is feeling, just that they're feeling something intensely. It tells you something is happening, but it sure doesn't tell you why.
So the brain's action is just the final step. To understand why the amygdala fired in that specific way, we need to step back again to the minutes just before. You talk about sensory cues and how our environment primes us. What does that mean?
Priming is all about those subtle, often unconscious cues in the environment that nudge our brain one way or another. It's the sights, the sounds, the smells that we're not even aware of, but that are shaping our subsequent thoughts and behaviors. It's the context that tells the amygdala whether to interpret a situation as threatening or benign.
Can you give us an example of that? It sounds so subtle.
There's a beautiful study I discuss in the book. You have people play an economic game. For half of them, you call it the Wall Street game. For the other half, you call it the community game. The rules are identical, but the results are night and day. The Wall Street game group plays in a cutthroat, competitive way. The community game group is vastly more cooperative. Just changing 2 words completely reframed the situation and altered their behavior without them even realizing it. That's priming.
That's fascinating. So there are external cues. What about internal ones, like hormones that are active in those minutes beforehand? I'm thinking of something like oxytocin, the so-called love hormone.
Right, and oxytocin is a perfect example of this complexity. We think of it as making us more trusting, more cooperative, more loving, and it does. But it has a dark side. It doesn't make you nicer to everyone. It makes you nicer to people you perceive as part of your in-group, your us. And critically, it makes you more distrustful and xenophobic toward them, the outsiders.
So it enhances that divide?
Precisely. In one study, Dutch men given a dose of oxytocin were put in a moral dilemma where they could sacrifice one person to save a group. The hormone made them less likely to sacrifice a guy with a classic Dutch name, but it had no effect on their willingness to sacrifice someone with a German or Middle Eastern name. It's not a universal love hormone, it's a parochial one. It just makes us exaggerate the us versus them divide that's already there.
Okay, so let's zoom out even further. We've covered seconds and minutes. What about the hours, days, and even decades before a behavior? How does a lifetime of experience shape the brain that's making these split-second decisions?
This is where we get into neuroplasticity, the idea that the brain is constantly changing based on experience. A great example is the frontal cortex, the part of the brain that's all about impulse control, long-term planning, and emotional regulation. The thing is, it doesn't finish wiring itself up until you're in your mid-20s. So for all of adolescence, you've got this supercharged emotional limbic system, the gas pedal, and a frontal cortex that's still being built, the brakes. That helps explain a lot about teenage behavior.
So our brains are literally being sculpted by our lives? Is your concrete example of that physical change? Oh, a classic, beautiful one is the work on London taxi drivers. To get their license, they have to memorize the knowledge, this incredibly complex map of thousands of streets in London. And studies showed that the part of their brain dealing with spatial memory, the posterior hippocampus, was physically larger than in control subjects. What's more, the longer they'd been on the job, the larger it was. Experience was literally building a bigger brain region. That's incredible, and it must mean that our childhood is just profoundly important in this sculpting process. How do early life experiences like socioeconomic status play into this?
They're monumental. Socioeconomic status, or SES, is a huge predictor of all sorts of life outcomes, and it shapes the brain through many pathways. One is parenting style. On average, higher SES parents who tend to live in safer environments are more likely to use what's called an authoritative style. They encourage kids to ask, why? In contrast, lower SES parents, often living in more dangerous settings, are more likely to use an authoritarian style, because I said so. And neither is inherently better or worse. They are simply different adaptations to prepare a child for the world they are likely to inhabit. One prepares you to question authority, the other prepares you to obey it for your own safety.
This feels like a natural point to zoom out again, beyond one person's life, to the culture they're born into. These parenting styles don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by centuries of societal history, right?
Exactly. You can think of different cultures as these massive, long-running experiments in how to structure a society. Individualistic cultures versus collectivist cultures, for example, they generate different kinds of people with different kinds of brains who respond to situations in systematically different ways. These are the deep currents that shape our individual lives.
Is there one major factor within a culture that you see having an outsized impact?
If I had to pick one, it would be the degree of economic inequality. It's just corrosive. Societies with high levels of inequality consistently have lower levels of what's called social capital. Basically, how much you trust other people. They have more violence, worse health, more stress. Conversely, more egalitarian societies, like you see in Scandinavia, have incredibly high levels of social trust. Inequality doesn't just affect the poor, it frays the entire social fabric for everyone.
And you show in the book how these cultural values can have very deep, even ecological roots. I'm thinking of your example of the culture of honor, Robert Sapolsky.
Yes, that's a fascinating case. You see these cultures of honor, where reputation and retaliation are paramount, emerge in specific environments. Think of pastoralists, herders in deserts or mountains. Your entire wealth is on the hoof. It can be stolen overnight. In that context, you can't rely on a sheriff miles away. Your only protection is a reputation for ferocious retaliation. So you develop this entire cultural system around honor. It shows this amazing chain. The economy shapes the economy, which shapes the culture, which then shapes the kind of individuals who live there.
Wow. So that brings us to the deepest layer of all. We've gone from seconds to centuries, now we're going back millions of years, to our evolutionary history as a species. How does that ancient past still influence our behavior today?
This is the bedrock. This is about the selective pressures that shaped what kind of primate we are. Why do we form social bonds? Why do we have hierarchies? Why are we so prone to dividing the world into us and them? The basic architecture for all of that was laid down over millions of years of evolution.
You make a really interesting distinction in the book between two types of species, tournament species and pair bonding species. Can you explain that?
Sure. It's a spectrum, really. At one end, you have tournament species, like peacocks or elephant seals. The males are huge, aggressive, and they fight for access to females. The winner gets to mate with everyone, so there's low male parental investment. At the other end, you have pair bonding species, where males and females are similar in size, there's low aggression, and males invest heavily in their offspring.
And where do humans fall?
We are maddeningly right in the middle. We show traits of both. We form long-term pair bonds, but we also have polygamy. We have intense male-male competition, but also high paternal care. This in-between nature explains our enormous flexibility and our potential for both incredible cooperation and terrible violence.
Speaking of primates, a lot of your own research was on baboons and social rank. The assumption is that it's always stressful to be at the bottom of the hierarchy, but you found it's more complicated. Robert Sapolsky.
Much more complicated. Intuitively, you'd think low rank equals high stress, and sometimes that's true. But what my work showed is that the psychological context is everything. It's not about your rank, it's about what your rank means in that particular society. In a stable troop where you have friends and family to groom with, being a low ranker can be relatively low stress. But if you're in an unstable hierarchy where you're constantly being harassed with no social outlets, then it's incredibly stressful. The biology doesn't exist separately from the social context.
So after going through all these layers, neurons, hormones, childhood, culture, evolution, the picture that emerges is one of staggering complexity. It seems like the biggest takeaway is that there are no simple answers.
That's it exactly. Anyone who says the reason people do X is because of this gene or this hormone or this childhood trauma, anyone who claims it's just one thing is selling snake oil. The truth is, it's all of them. All these factors are interacting all at once to produce any given behavior. And that has some really profound implications for how we think about things like responsibility and justice.
It really does, because it leads directly to the biggest, thorniest philosophical question of all, free will. If every single action is the result of this cascade of causes stretching back to the dawn of time, where does that leave room for us being in control? Robert Sapolsky.
It leaves very, very little room. As we get better at understanding all the biological and environmental precursors to behavior, the space for some sort of magical, independent, free will to operate just keeps shrinking. For every behavior, we can find the influences that came before it.
You call this the problem of the homunculus, right? The idea of a little person in our head pulling the levers?
Exactly. It's this intuitive feeling that there's a me inside my brain, a CEO in the control room, that is making the decisions. But when you actually look at the brain, there's no such place. There's no part of the brain that is immune to all those influences we've been talking about. The decider is itself a biological system, shaped by everything that came before. There's no ghost in the machine.
So if we accept that free will, as we commonly think of it, probably doesn't exist, how on earth are we supposed to function? How do you live your life with that knowledge? Robert Sapolsky. It's tremendously difficult. I admit in the book I can't do it. I can't live my life as if I don't make choices. It feels like I do. But what I argue is that we should reserve the heavy lifting of this way of thinking for when it matters most, when we are judging other people, especially when we are judging them harshly. Understanding the biology doesn't mean condoning harmful behavior. It means shifting our focus from blame and retribution to causality and prevention. It means understanding that people don't create themselves. Robert, thank you for such a deep and rigorous conversation. This discussion gives our listeners a much richer way to think about human behavior.
Thank you, Sunny. I hope this conversation helps people approach behavior, their own and others, with more understanding and nuance.
This has been Sunny's Mindset Lab. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.